molten iron. Now here's a puzzle. We'll try to figure it out as we go along. Now this section applies to both the Twin Towers and Building 7, this molten iron section. Let's take a look at this stuff pouring out of the facade of the South Tower at the 78th floor where the jet plane went in. We're told by NIST that this substance is aluminum. Well, it's obviously molten metal. Is it aluminum? Aluminum is silvery when it's molten in daylight conditions. It doesn't glow bright orange. It can only be molten steel or molten iron. Let's keep that in mind as we proceed. Who says this? As of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running. None other than Leslie Robertson, the structural engineer for the design of the World Trade Center. To a conference of structural engineers, he says this on October 5th, less than a month after 9/11. And his associate, Richard Garlock, the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. And this urban search and rescue worker, fires burned, molten metal flowed in the pile of ruins still settling beneath my feet. I remember seeing red-hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile several weeks after the collapse, says this structural engineer from Maroop, David Scott. What did the first responders and demolition contractors say about molten metal? Well, here's Peter Tully, lead contractor for the site cleanup, president of Tully Construction. He saw pools of literally molten steel. Dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Steel flowed in molten streams. They're finding molten steel, seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams, red-hot weeks after the events. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains, molten steel beams. And this structural engineer, Abul Hasan Astani from Berkeley, with a National Science Foundation grant to study the steel, so it documents the melting of girders. And the 9/11 Commission report, still so hot, molten metal dripped down the sides of the wall from Building 6. And concrete was melted. Concrete, the temperature for concrete is 3,000 degrees. It doesn't melt until then. And these...
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat.
And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
Well, it's not aluminum from an airplane also because aluminum doesn't rust. These meteorites they're pulling out of the ground by the ton are either steel or iron. We'll take a look. And these USGS overflights taking infrared images find 1,300 to 1,400 degree temperatures at the base of the Twin Towers and Building 7. Well, these are as hot as the hottest office fires. Problem is, there's no office fires on the ground zero after the collapse of these buildings. What are they measuring? They're measuring the radiant heat from the molten metal well down in the basements, which is easily twice these temperatures. Like this stuff they're pulling out of this backhoe. And Thomas Iger, the official story, says, we believe there's 1,200 degree temperatures in the office fires in the Twin Towers. But steel doesn't even begin to melt until 2,700 degrees. Concrete, 3,000 degrees. There's twice the amount of heat energy required here than the official story can account for. What is going on? We're going to take a look at another source called thermite, which creates temperatures of over 4,000 degrees. The liquid molten metal falling out of the debris in the jaws of this grappler on site. Now, let's listen to the official story from John Gross, telling us what they believe about the molten metal.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
No eyewitness who said so.
There actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug up.
No eyewitness who says so.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
No eyewitness who says so.
The piece of metal that's draped over was molten metal.
No eyewitness who says so.
Some proofs of literally molten steel.
Nobody who's produced it.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
Nobody who's produced it. Nobody who's produced it. Nobody who's produced it.
NASA pictures, thermal images showed those sorts of temperatures in the basement.
Did we make the point? Somebody's lying. Why? The official story cannot possibly account for these temperatures required to produce the melting of steel. What are they afraid of? We'll find out here in a moment. Do we have chemical evidence of cutter charges? Chemical evidence of explosives? Could thermite have produced all that molten metal? And what is thermite anyway?
Thermite, an incendiary used by the military. Thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, this is a helpful introduction. Dr. Jones has done some analysis, as it turns out. He's a physicist formerly from Brigham Young University. So do we have any evidence tying thermite to the molten metal? Let's see. He does his background research first and finds that if you had thermite, you'd have a white-yellow hot liquid metal, an intense white reaction zone, aluminum oxide off-gassing, and you would have common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. Do we have those types of elements? So let's do an analysis. Somebody sent him a chunk of this 12 by 12 sample of previously molten iron pulled out of the Twin Tower debris. And he finds that it's predominantly iron in his electron microprobe data analysis. So we can rule out aluminum from the jet planes. It's iron. Iron is not a component in building materials. It is part of the alloy for structural steel, certainly. But this is pure iron with these other very small elements, like has lots of manganese in it. So we know it's not melted structural steel. This is very important. Some people say, oh, the steel melted because it was down in the pile and insulated and it got hotter and hotter and hotter. This is not steel, this is iron. And it has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, and potassium, key ingredients in thermite.